One of the first museums that we went to ask for loans and to even try out the idea for the exhibition was the Brooklyn Museum, which has incredibly important collections of material from Egypt. And Ed Bleiberg is the head of, I have to read his title, Managing Curator for Ancient Egypt, Africa, and Asia, Curator, Egyptian Classical and Ancient Near Eastern Art at the Brooklyn Museum, which actually gives you a sense of how these worlds, before the Second World War in particular, were kind of all collapsed into one, and the separating out is a later phenomenon. He is much more truly an expert on ancient Egypt, but he has become and is interested in our exploration of what still remains to me a fascinating enigma, why the Brooklyn Museum wished to acquire mosaics from a synagogue found in the mid-19th century in Tunisia. So I turn it over to Ed.
Thank you, Helen. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here today. When Helen came to visit Brooklyn, she made the same comment, that the Christians who were looking for the historical Jesus were collecting early Christian art and Byzantine art, and it got me to thinking about this very question: why would Brooklyn have wanted to acquire these mosaics, which were discovered in Tunisia in 1883, but come from a synagogue floor? And so this morning, in our brief time together, I'd like to talk a little bit about the world into which these mosaics came in the last quarter of the 19th century, and the way people thought about a subject that they didn't even know existed, Jewish art in antiquity. And then I'd like to jump up to the 21st century and contrast the kinds of questions that we ask about these objects today. So these three panels, which you see here, come from a synagogue floor discovered at Hamamlif, Tunisia, a town that's about 11 miles to the east of modern-day Tunis, right on the Mediterranean coast. And the synagogue faced the Mediterranean Sea and was in this small plateau between the beach and the mountains, so it must have been a very beautiful setting. The floor itself was measured about 9 by 5 meters, so about 25 square feet. It was discovered by Captain Ernest de Prudhomme, a French soldier stationed in Hamamlif, and was actually discovered accidentally while Prudhomme's soldiers laid out a vegetable garden for Prudhomme. They were not at all looking they were not trying to do archaeology at all, but when they dug only a few centimeters below the surface, they began to turn out, as Prudhomme described it, colorful stones, which he recognized right away were tesserae of a mosaic. Because the two people looked at the mosaic, which was excavated in the course of about 2 or 3 weeks. The people moved much faster back then, but Prudhomme invited Father A.L. Delattre, who was a Jesuit and the founder of the Musée Laoué, the first museum of classical material in Tunisia. And Father Delattre came and looked at the floor, and I invite you later to come up and take a look. This third panel on the left here, Delattre saw an alpha and an omega in the next to a menorah. And from that evidence, Delattre decided that this was a church, and that he needed no more information except for the alpha omega. The floor also had a patron's inscription, a donor's inscription, which was copied by Prudhomme and given to Gustave Schlumberger, who was a classicist who was visiting Tunisia at the time. And Schlumberger passed the inscription on to Ernst Renan, one of the leading philologists in France in this time period. And Renan published the inscriptions, there were actually 3 inscriptions altogether from the building, but he published the inscriptions, which I'll be talking about in a few minutes. But it's interesting that Renan accepted the building right away as a synagogue. And Renan is a very interesting scholar because as a classicist, he was very interested himself in discovering the historical Jesus, and was one of the first French and Catholic scholars to deal with the idea that Jesus lived in a knowable world, a world that was knowable from archaeology. Now, the next 2 scholars who dealt with the floor were 2 Jewish scholars who both published in 1886 articles in the Revue des Études Juives, one of the first Jewish studies scholarly journals. And these 2 scholars were David Kaufman and Solomon Ryna. Now, both of them were classicists, but they were classicists of a very particular sort, in that they were both Jewish. Ryna was a 2nd-generation French Jew. His family had originally come from Russia. David Kaufman actually lived in Hungary and was a subject of the Austrian Empire at that time, and was actually more part of the German Jewish school of Jewish studies. There were already, right away, Jewish studies was in its infancy, but already there were 2 different schools of it. Now, the German Jewish school tended to be more nationalistic and particularistic, and tended to see Jewish material from the classical world as being totally separate from everything else that could be found in the classical world. Whereas in the French school of Jewish studies in this time period, French Jews particularly were interested in the way that this material represented assimilationist tendencies in the Roman and the Byzantine world. Now, these scholars were heavily influenced by their own personal experiences. Remember that in Europe, France was the first country where Jews were able to become citizens rather than resident aliens. And so the Ryna family, after the Revolution of 1789, and so the Ryna family, especially, and Solomon Ryna, was a second-generation French Jewish citizen who would have identified himself as, first of all, French and only secondarily Jewish. Not particularly religious. Ryna saw himself as an exemplar of a kind of Darwinian progression, and he was very explicit about this, that would eventually, that saw, first of all, Judaism as the most ancient form of this monotheistic religion, which then progressed to Christianity and Islam, but eventually, and Reinach was also very explicit about this, believed that religion, as human beings progressed, there would be no need for religion. And by the early 20th century, Reinach was already talking about exporting French secular culture and therefore allowing the rest of the world also to benefit from a totally secular world. Now, but Reinach also, as a Jew who was involved in Jewish causes, and especially in the Dreyfusard, in the affair of the Dreyfus affair, he was involved in the defense of Captain Dreyfus. Reinach realized that being Jewish was a real thing for him, and that it influenced society's reactions to him, and he was interested in the role that Judaism had played in Western culture, as well as in ancient Oriental cultures. Now, Kaufman, as I said, these two scholars who talked about it, Kaufman was able to recognize this building as a synagogue, and which is what it says in the inscription, by the way. But Reinach, in keeping with his ideas about the evolution of religion suggested that, yes, there are menorahs, and the inscription does say synagogue, but Jews would never have had figurative decoration on their floors. Remember, no one had ever seen a synagogue floor from the ancient world before 1883, when this was discovered. This was the very first building of this type to be discovered in modern times. So Ryna suggests that when this building was converted to a church, that's when the floor was added. And the menorahs are just left over from an original building. There's absolutely no reason to think this. But it does fit very nicely with Ryna's own ideas about the way religion developed in the Western world. Now, Prudhomme took these, so that's sort of the world that these mosaics came into. In the meantime, as you're probably aware, there are about 300 such synagogue floors known today, and the floor here is very, very similar to those in that it is largely a reflection of the world around it, with some adaptation to Jewish beliefs. Captain Prudhomme, the discoverer of the floor, took 25 panels back to France with him and left the remainder of the floor at the Musée Alaoui, which later became the Bardo Museum. Its collection became the Bardo, the main archaeological museum in Tunis today. And the mosaics show up again at the Hôtel du Rouault in 1891 at a March sale where Edward Schenk of Toulouse bought 21 panels of mosaic. Now, unfortunately, that's all I know about Schenk. He seems to have a Jewish name. He lived in Toulouse. He was a jeweler, and that's all I can really find out. But he seems to have died around 1905, and it's at that time that the Brooklyn Museum acquires these mosaics from a sale at Roland and Fouardon in Paris. Now, the mosaics were acquired by the museum through its agents, Henri and Jacques de Morgan. Now, these two brothers worked as archaeologists for the museum in Egypt, and from 1905 to 1909, but they also acquired additional antiquities for the museum. Now, you have to remember what the Brooklyn Museum looked like in 1905. It had only the present building was built in 1898, but in 1905, a large gallery was added along Eastern Parkway, and this was a large, empty galleries, 5 floors of galleries, which essentially had no objects in them, and so the museum was acquiring like crazy. The de Morgan brothers were also associated with the Musée de Saint-Germain-en-Laye in Paris, and who was the director of that museum? It was Salomon Ryna, the man who had such an interest in these mosaics. So I suspect that the original connection between the museum and these mosaics was made between the de Morgan brothers and Salomon Ryna. Now, what audience was the museum appealing to when they bought these Jewish mosaics in 1905? And although I can't prove this, there are some very suggestive facts that I can talk about. One of the primary patrons of the Brooklyn Museum in 1905 was Abraham, the founder of the Abraham and Strauss department store, which was first in Brooklyn, in downtown Brooklyn. And interestingly, Abraham had a history very similar to Ryna's in that he was a second-generation American. His father had come from Bavaria and settled in Brooklyn. And after Abraham's tremendous success in merchandising, he becomes assimilated both into a large number of charities in Brooklyn, the museum. He's involved with hospitals, but he's also involved with Jewish charities. And he's another figure of what was possible for Jews in the United States because they could be citizens and because they had full legal rights. The other major acquisition that the Brooklyn Museum made in 1905 is a series of watercolors by James Tissot, known as The Life of Christ. And this is a series of 650 watercolors which places Jesus in an archaeological setting. They were originally executed for a Bible, which was very popular in France, and the entire life of Christ is placed into a first-century Roman Palestinian setting that also illustrates the tremendous interest which religious people took in archaeology in that time period. Still today, there's a tremendous interest in archaeology among religious people, but in the early 20th century, this was just being discovered, that Jesus as a human being actually lived in a setting which could be reconstructed. So I suspect that these mosaics were acquired as a kind of companion to this whole archaeological interest in them. I'd like to now skip up to the 21st century and my own interests in these mosaics, which came when the director of the museum, Arnold Lehman, asked me to do a little exhibition about our hammam leaf mosaics. And now, this was a fairly daunting task for an Egyptologist whose interest was in the New Kingdom. Therefore, these objects are brand new, according to my specialty. But when I looked at these mosaics, I was very interested in the inscriptions, especially that are preserved in the Bardo Museum today, and it shows how our interests have changed. I think the patron's inscription reads something like this in English. It's in Latin, but it translates something like this: "Your servant Julia Knopp, at her own expense, paved the holy synagogue of Naro." Naro is the name of the ancient Phoenician name of hammam leaf, with mosaic for her salvation. Julia Knopp paved the holy synagogue of Naro with mosaic for her salvation. Now, the first thing that struck me as a 21st century man was, oh, it was a woman who paid for this mosaic. It speaks to my own education in the late 20th century, and especially going to school only a mile away from Bryn Mawr, and being heavily influenced by second wave feminism. And here was a question that never ever comes up in the early discussion of the hammam leaf mosaics. No, Ryna doesn't care, Schlumberger doesn't care, Renan doesn't care. This woman named Julia, with her own funds, it says, is a patroness for this synagogue. And it got me interested in the whole question of female patronage in this time period. And it turns out that there are studies of such things made mostly in the 21st century, and that about a third of the 300 synagogues that we know from the ancient times, about a third of them, the major patron was a woman, which is very, very suggestive. It raised, for me, as a Reform Jew actually, it raised all kinds of questions for me about, well, if a woman is paying for the synagogue, does that mean she has to sit in the balcony separate from the main action of the ritual? And in fact, I believe it's highly unlikely that women were separated. Even in the second century of the Common Era, there are anti-Jewish polemics talk about the fact that men and women are seated together in the synagogue, and this is evidence for these bishops. This is evidence of sinfulness of what's actually going on in synagogues. So that kind of question, I think, comes from the world that I live in. The other question that struck me was the fact that the inscription is in Latin. Now, the vast majority of inscriptions in synagogues are in Greek or in Aramaic. This community, however, was so assimilated in Roman North Africa that all three inscriptions from this particular synagogue are in Latin, showing perhaps that this community may have actually originated in Italy. That is, that it may have come from the Jewish community around in Rome when Tunisia and the rest of Roman North Africa was settled. A lot of colonists came from Italy, and I suspect that the ancestors of this, the founders of the synagogue, actually came also from Rome, which is the only other place where you get a lot of Jewish inscriptions in Latin rather than in Greek and Aramaic. So I hope this gives you some idea of how these objects, as they float through our own time, take on new meanings and stimulate new questions for their reception. Thanks. Are there any questions? Yes.
Did the floor have come from a building that was, although it was a Jewish synagogue, it was actually a follower of Christian Judaism? These were the big converts to the new idea because they didn't have to be circumcised in order to join or convert, and the women might have been more likely to be Latin rather than Hebraic literate.
You know, the question of when Christians began to see themselves as something different from Jews. You know, originally Christians saw themselves as a particular kind of Jew. And I unfortunately am not an expert on this, but I did try to read as much as I could about it. And the separation by the time these mosaics are made in the about 500 of the Common Era probably is mostly complete by this time. But there is a very long time period where in Christianity where they see themselves as just as essentially Jews. Whether this community is still some sort of remainder of Christian, combination of Christians and Jews is a very interesting question. I kind of skipped over the question of whether there really is an Alpha and Omega on the floor or not, and part of the difficulty for answering the question is we know that that particular panel has changed since 1883. Like the Yale mosaic, these mosaics were divided up into panels and sunk in concrete with steel frames sometime before they reached Brooklyn in 1905, sometime between 1883 and 1905. So the original appearance of many of those mosaics, of these mosaics, has changed slightly. We have a drawing made on the site in 1883 that was published in 1881. There's a copy of the drawing right here, which I urge you to take a look at. When the panels were reset, they were just like the Yale mosaic. They were treated as if they were paintings. And they were actually given a row of black tesserae all the way around to create a kind of frame for them. And in Brooklyn, they hung on the wall. I didn't really talk about the installation. They hung on the wall from 1905 until the 1980s, when they were removed for the renovation of a gallery that was eventually lost to my department. And that was the reason why we weren't able to reinstall them. So they're in storage these days. Yes, sir.
We've heard earlier that the Met, at exactly this time in 1905, was transforming its ambitions and scope. Was Brooklyn just trying to compete here, or did they define what they were trying to do as in some way different from what the Met was doing?
The Brooklyn Museum is actually much older than the Met. It was founded in 1823 in Brooklyn, and it regarded itself as a universal museum. The building phase that was completed in 1905 completed 1/6 of the original building plan. The building was supposed to be 6 times larger than our current building. And we sent expeditions all over the world to collect, to fill up this enormous building. It was planned to be the largest museum in the world at the time. The great tragedy old Brooklynites tell you is that Brooklyn made the mistake of joining the city of New York in 1898 and was no longer an independent city. And patronage flowed toward Manhattan after that. And so Brooklyn was never able to complete its grand plans. So I don't think at that time we were reacting so much to the Metropolitan Museum. We had our own plans to be a universal museum.
Our great facade is 1907, so we're actually following.
Yes.
I think if I remember correctly, the Tissot Bible was purchased by subscriptions. I don't know whether that was for the public library or for the Brooklyn collection, but that whole enterprise of Tissot was to kind of sell pieces of it. And I was just wondering if that affected the collecting of antiquities in Brooklyn as well. To get more private collectors to collect for the public institution.
Right. The Tissot watercolors that were from the Tissot Bible were collected by subscription, and they were collected. I mean, even school children were making very small donations for the collection of the first really some of the first paintings which came into the collection at that time. The credit line on the mosaics is museum fund, which is very vague and doesn't really mean very much to us. There is the Abraham son-in-law, Edward Blum, did create a fund for acquisitions, but not necessarily for antiquities. I think it's also important for us to think about what kind of antiquities were people looking at in New York and in Brooklyn in 1905. And you've got to remember that both museums mostly were showing plaster casts of the great antiquities known from Rome, for example. And Brooklyn foolishly deaccessioned all of its plaster casts, but the main gallery, classical gallery that you walked into in 1905 was a room filled with plaster casts that you would have seen had you visited the Capitoline Museum or the Vatican Museum. You would have seen the originals there. And those were on display for a very long time until they were gradually replaced by genuine antiquities. I mean, today we wouldn't show them, but even as late as the 1930s, in the Egyptian department, we were acquiring plaster casts of objects. We have, in fact, in storage, we have a cast of the Berlin Nefertiti. I know the Egyptian collection but much better, obviously. And ours is even better because it has both eyes. So this is, people were looking at art much differently. And I grew up in Pittsburgh, and the Carnegie Museum, even when I was a child in the 1950s and 1960s, was still showing plaster casts of great objects from antiquity, both Egypt and classical antiquity. And in fact, when I was in kindergarten, I was very confused about what these objects were, and I thought they were genuine antiquities. My first interest in the ancient world came about by looking at these plaster casts. So these mosaics were something considered very special at the time because they were genuine antiquities rather than reproductions, which was mostly what people were used to looking at in New York at that time.
I'm just interested in, did the public subscriptions extend to buying Coptic art? Because we have people buying by public subscription the textiles that are coming out of graves in Egypt in the 1880s. So it's a huge public interest in material that we would have trouble finding public donors to buy in the same way today. Did Brooklyn do the same?
No, we didn't. Our collection of Coptic textiles and other Coptic art was put together by a member of the Pratt family. The Pratts, the founders of Pratt Institute, were associated with the Rockefeller family. They were part of Standard Oil, and they donated, eventually they were Baptists, and they eventually donated a very large private collection, I think about 600 Coptic textiles. They donated it first to the Long Island Historical Society, and then in 1943, the that society transferred the collection to Brooklyn, the Brooklyn Museum. Other questions? Thank you.